Alright, so we left off with the attack on Fort Sumter. This next lecture isn't going to get into battles yet, but we will be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the Confederacy and the Union for the duration of the war. So the first thing we're going to hit on is what were the strengths of the Union. The first being that the Union just have more people. We see that we'll have 22 million Northerners compared to 9 million Southerners. So the Union have numbers on their side. Another big thing is that core slave states will remain loyal to the Union throughout the war. We have these border states who don't secede, but they might have some Southern loyalty. But when it comes down to it, they're still in the Union. So that will help us out a little bit. The Union is also going to have more military experience, naval supremacy, and they're also just more industrial. And so with this, we're going to have higher productions of weapons, of ships, and also more means of supplying food and supplies on the front line for Union forces. And if we take a look at the map, we'll see that the Union is going to dominate in terms of population, manufacturing goods, merchant ships, and even in banking capital. And so this automatically sets up the Union for success. Next thing to look at really quick is why was Maryland going to be so important? And the answer is we have Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the Union that sits between Maryland and Virginia. And Virginia will be important for the Confederate troops in that Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the Confederacy after secession. And so if the Confederacy ever did decide to cross over this river in attempt to take over the Union capital, this would pretty much be the fall of the Union. So Union forces really need to focus on protecting the capital and also protecting Maryland to prevent Confederate takeover. And we'll see that shortly after the beginning of the Civil War, in April 1861, Union soldiers are attacked by pro-Confederate townspeople that results in the killing of 16. And so Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, which is saying, all right, no judge, no trial. We're just going to arrest people who are suspected of conducting this attack. And so with this, it shows that Lincoln was able to go to extreme measures as far as breaking the Constitution in order to protect the capital. And again, Richmond will be a really important target for the Union in the same respect, and that you want to take over the capital in order to weaken your enemy's forces. Looking into some Confederacy strengths, so just the size of the Confederacy is going to be their greatest asset, and that we have 750,000 square miles of Confederate land. The majority of this being where we're going to see major battles in the war. And so with all of this land, it's really going to be difficult for Union forces to blockade and surround the Confederacy and also to conquer these major areas. And even if they did conquer, it's going to be difficult to hold down a resentful population. Another big thing for Confederate troops is that because they're fighting mainly on their home ground, they have these interior lines of communications when it comes to roads and railroads. So in supplying their troops with food or with weapons, they're going to have easier access in order to do so. Another big benefit about fighting on your home turf is that you really only have to focus on defense. And when it comes to war, that's the position you want to be in. You're just focusing on guarding your ground and on protecting your troops, protecting your forts, and not attacking. You really just want to guard and defend. Looking into a couple more strengths of the Confederacy, we know that slaves were not allowed to fight in battle, but they were allowed to perform certain military tasks, some being transporting goods to the front line and also building certain fortifications. Southerners are also going to dominate senior posts in the Army, and that a lot of elite generals were Southerners. And so they're going to have experience and a lot of organization and strategical tactics on their side that can help them prove successful in the war. Another main thing is that the South is going to have a really significant economic weapon, which will be cotton, and that if the South can produce and sell cottons to Europe, they can use this money to buy further weapons and supplies for their troops. Looking into, was either side actually prepared for war? Because the short answer is no. In that at the beginning of the war, we had the Union Army that scattered out west, and so they don't have a concentrated military off the bat. Lincoln also has no military experience. And the leading general at the beginning of the war, General Scott, has no staff and no plans as a result. Looking into Confederacy, so the Confederacy has to start their military organization from scratch, and that they seceded from the Union. So any military organization that they had belonged to the United States. So with secession, they have to start from zero. Their president did have some military experience, And Southern state militias were better prepared compared to Union militias. However, the Confederacy's real problem is going to be equipping their volunteers. So their people will have the experience, but they're not going to have the means of production that the Union has in securing their side weapons. And we'll see with just a quick look at the graph over here, we have our blue representing the Union and the gray representing the Confederacy, and that, again, because the Union was more industrial, they're going to be able to produce more weapons at a faster rate compared to the Confederate troops. So looking into how is each side able to enlist such large armies, at the beginning of the war, we had a lot of men volunteering. However, it doesn't take long for each side to require more men in securing their army and to secure their victory in the war. And so March of 1862, the Confederate President Davis, he introduces the draft or conscription, which really calls for all white males age 18 to 45 to serve in the Confederate Army for the duration of the war. And we'll see a year later in March 1863, President Lincoln is going to introduce the draft to the Union Army as well. And he's going to call for all able-bodied men age 40 or 20 to 45 for the duration of the war as well. We'll see that the drafts, they have a few, or they go through a few different stages, but it ultimately comes down to these men serving for the duration of the war and securing victory for their side. And a big thing is that for each side, they're not going to have any regiment choice. They pretty much go where they're needed. And with this, there was real hope that this would encourage more men to volunteer, and that if there was a chance they would get drafted, they would rather just volunteer in order to be able to go where they would please. And so the draft, in the end, it really does a decent job at securing some numbers for each side in the Army, and that by 1865, we see that we have 900,000 Confederate forces compared to 2.1 million Union forces. And so really how the draft would work is you would have numbers go into a draft wheel shown over here, and it's really produced in the same way that the lottery is played out today, and that you have a number that is drawn from the draft wheel publicly, and on that has a number, and the number represents a birthday, and so if that's your birthday, then you're first up to the line, and it kind of goes on in a sequential order as far as who's the next to be drafted into the war. Looking into how our battles won and some certain battle tactics, so we have the advent of the rifle musket, which is a muzzle-loading, single-shot weapon with a 600-yard radius, which pretty much just comes down to you have your gun over here, you load your lead ball down into the barrel, and then with that you have one shot because you have one ball, and with this you can hit within a 600-yard radius. And so with this and how you would attack using this weapon is you would have your offense attacking in mass formations with this idea of advancing by rushes. And so you have two lines of ranks that would attack. You've got your third in the back for reserve, and the commanders were really focusing on turning the enemy's flank or really attacking their enemy from the sides just to avoid mass casualties. Because you can imagine, if you're coming at your enemy head on, then your front lines are going to get completely knocked out. Those guys are done. And so if you're going at the side, you can try to avoid these casualties. But again, this is going to have an advantage for the defense, and that you just have to sit and wait for your enemy to come at you. And when they do come at you, then you're able to attack, annihilate, and then just move on and claim your victory. And so defenders were really just trying to keep their flanks well guarded and just wait for their attackers to come to them. Looking into another military position being our cavalrymen, which is our men on our horses, their main job was to scout and screen movements and also raid enemy supplies. Looking into a little bit more of our artillery, we'll have the rifle musket, which is going to be safe, but this is at the expense of range, just in that we're able to hit within a 600-yard radius. However, we're going to have a lot of country and a lot of forest, a lot of trees that are going to get in our way, and it's going to disallow for maximum utilization of this weapon. The Union, again, just because they're more industrial, they're going to have greater artillery strength compared to their rebel army, which vocab word, rebel army is what the Union would refer to the Confederate forces as, and so the Union are going to have better production and better guns compared to the rebel army. Looking into naval battles, and was that a thing during the Civil War? So we'll see that the Union is going to convert many of their merchant ships for wartime use, and a main thing that they're going to do in this is blockading the South, and that they want to blockade the coastline in order to prevent the South from selling cottons for guns and for further weapons. And so with this, they're also going to have a lot of strikes on coastal targets. And in April of 1862, New Orleans is captured by the Union. And this is a major thing just because it's the South's greatest port, the biggest port at the time. We'll also see that the North is producing these massive ironclad ships, which is just a warship that is protected with iron or steel. And the South, they're trying to produce iron ships as well, but of course, they're not doing as well of a job compared to the Union. But we do have a small ironclad battle, the Monitor versus the Merrimac. So in March of 1862, we have the Confederate iron ship, the Merrimac, sink 2 Union blockade ships. So as a result, the Union retaliates by getting into a short ironclad battle, the first of its kind. And while neither ship is sunk, the Monitor is able to do some heavy damage to the Merrimac, and as a result, the Confederate Merrimac has to go back for repairs, but it is eventually abandoned. And so we see here an ironclad ship, again, just a warship that's going to be used for naval battles. And this is where we will stop for this video.